The air at the Henderson estate auction hung thick and heavy, a mix of late August humidity, cheap cigar smoke, and the faint, sad smell of a life being sold off, piece by piece. Arthur Miller stood near the back, his arms crossed over his chest, his knuckles stained with grease that no amount of boraxo soap could ever fully scrub away. He wasn't here for the big items. He was a vulture, same as the rest, picking over the bones for a usable set of cultivators or a spare hydraulic cylinder that might fit his aging John Deere. Then the auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Simmons with a sweat-stained straw hat, moved to the prize of the day. A nearly new International Harvester 850 tractor. It was a beautiful machine, all sharp angles and bold red paint gleaming under the high sun. It had maybe 400 hours on the clock. Old man Henderson had bought it the year before, a final grasp at keeping up before his heart gave out in the middle of a corn row. The bidding started hot. 2,000, 2,500, 3,000. Art just watched. That was more cash than he kept on hand in a year. The numbers climbed, voices from the crowd calling out bids with a mix of hope and desperation. Then a voice cut through the others, loud and confident. 6,000. A hush fell over the small crowd. Every head turned to Dale Peterson. He stood near the front, leaning against the fender of his new Ford pickup, a smirk playing on his lips. Dale was Art's neighbor to the west. He farmed twice the acres and carried 10 times the debt, a fact he wore like a badge of honor. He'd just bought a brand new 1066 with a factory cab and air conditioning the previous spring, the first of its kind in the county. Simmons's eyes lit up. $6,000 from Mr. Peterson. Do I hear 61? 6,100. Silence. The other bidders, men with dirt under their nails and worry in their eyes, just shook their heads and shuffled their feet. They couldn't touch that. That was bank money. Big bank money. Sold. Simmons slammed his gavel down on his podium. For $6,000 to Dale Peterson. A smattering of polite applause rippled through the crowd. Dale pushed himself off his truck and swaggered toward the auctioneer, pulling a checkbook from his shirt pocket. As he passed Art, he paused. "Still running that old 40-20, Art?" Dale asked, his voice loud enough for a dozen other farmers to hear. Art's jaw tightened. He just nodded. "She runs." "Runs?" Dale chuckled, a condescending, grating sound. "Yeah, I suppose she does. My boy's got a pedal tractor that runs, too. You ought to get with the times. A man can't make a living with museum pieces." He clapped Art on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to seem friendly, but felt like a shove, and continued on his way. The other farmers nearby looked away, some with pity, others with a faint look of agreement with Dale. Art felt a familiar heat rise in his neck. He turned and walked away from the auction, the bidding for hay rakes and post-hole diggers fading behind him. He had work to do. Back in his own lane, the gravel crunching under the worn tires of his Chevy C10, the world felt right again. To his left were his fields of soybeans, leaves full and dark green. To his right, the corn stood tall and proud, and at the end of the lane was the heart of it all. The old hip-roof barn his grandfather had raised with his own 2 hands, and next to it, the long, low machine shed that was Art's sanctuary. The shed wasn't pretty. The corrugated steel siding was faded to a pale, chalky red, and a few panels were speckled with rust. But inside, it was a cathedral of iron and oil. The air was thick with the smells of diesel fuel, gear lube, and hot metal. Along one wall stood a heavy wooden workbench, scarred and stained from decades of work. Above it, tools hung in a meticulous order that only Art understood. A massive chain hoist hung from a reinforced ceiling beam, its greasy links dangling like a sleeping python. and there, in the center of the concrete floor, sat his queen, the 1968 John Deere 4020. She wasn't shiny like Dale's new International. Her green paint was faded on the hood and fenders from thousands of hours under the prairie sun. The black seat cushion was cracked, revealing the yellow foam beneath. But Art knew every bolt, every grease zerk, every quirk of her 6-cylinder diesel engine. He'd bought her used but in good shape 5 years ago, paying cash with money he'd saved from 2 bumper crops. It was the last major purchase he'd made. He ran a hand along the warm fender. Dale called it a museum piece. Maybe it was. But it was his. Every nut and bolt, paid for. No bank held a lien on it. No loan officer could call him up and threaten to take it away. It owed him nothing, and he owed nothing for it. The immediate task was a leaky hydraulic line for the 3-point hitch. It was a slow drip, but a drip was a waste, and waste was a sin. He grabbed a set of wrenches from the wall, heavy steel tools that felt solid and true in his hand. He lay down on a creeper and slid under the tractor's belly. The familiar smell of diesel and earth enveloped him. This was his world. Dale could have his air-conditioned cab and his AM/FM radio. Art would take this. The feel of cold steel, the satisfaction of a perfectly tightened fitting, the quiet hum of a machine brought back to health by his own 2 hands. A week later, Art was cultivating his beans when he saw a cloud of dust coming down the county road. It was Dale, not in his new 856, but in his even bigger 1066. The big International pulled a massive disc ripper, turning over the stubble on the newly acquired Henderson 80, the piece of land that bordered Art's own property line. Dale had bought it right out from under the estate auction, a private deal financed by the Farmers' Trust and Savings. Dale stopped the tractor near the fence line, the big turbo diesel settling into a low, powerful rumble that made the ground vibrate. He swung open the cab door, and the conditioned air that spilled out was a stark contrast to the humid heat Art was sitting in. "Making progress, Art," Dale yelled over the engine noise. Art throttled down the 4020. The steady, rhythmic pop, pop, pop of its engine was a gentle whisper compared to the IH's roar. "Looks like it," Art said, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a gloved hand. "Yep, bought the Henderson place. Got it for a song," Dale said with a grin. "Gotta expand. Land prices are only going one way. Up. You snooze, you lose in this game." He looked over Art's smaller cultivator, then back at his own massive implement. "You ought to think about it. The bank's loaning money hand over fist right now. A man's a fool not to take it and grow." Art just looked at the freshly turned black earth of the Henderson 80. He'd always hoped that land would come up for sale when he had the cash, but cash was slow and the bank was fast. "I'm doing all right," Art said, his voice flat. Dale just laughed, a sound that was swallowed by the rumble of his tractor. "Suit yourself. Some of us are trying to build an empire. Others are happy polishing antiques." He slammed the cab door shut, the noise sealing him back in his climate-controlled bubble. He throttled up, and the International Harvester roared to life, digging its huge tires into the earth and pulling the massive disc forward, leaving a trail of perfectly tilled soil and diesel smoke in its wake. Art watched him go, a knot forming in his gut. He looked at his own paid-for land, his paid-for tractor, and then at the empire Dale was building on a mountain of debt. Everyone in the county saw Dale as the future, the very picture of success. They saw Art as a relic, a stubborn man clinging to the past. Now, before we get any deeper into this story, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever known someone like Art, who stuck to the old ways and was mocked for it? Or maybe you knew a Dale who seemed to have it all figured out with brand new iron? Let me know in the comments below which man you think was on the right path back in 1971, because what happened next, nobody saw coming. The following spring, disaster struck in the form of a sound. It wasn't a loud bang or a catastrophic crash. It was a subtle, metallic grinding, a noise that came from deep within the guts of Art's second tractor, the old Farmel M his father had bought brand new in 1951. It was his planting tractor, lighter and nimbler than the 4020, perfect for pulling the 4-row corn planter. The sound started as a whisper, but by the time he finished the row and pulled onto the headland, it was a sickening groan. He knew that sound. It was the song of a dying transmission. He shut it down and sat there for a long moment, the sudden silence of the field pressing in on him. The timing couldn't be worse. It was the first week of May, the absolute heart of planting season. Every day lost was yield lost. Dale was already halfway done planting his corn, his big 12-row planter, a marvel of modern efficiency. Art could see him across the section, a red speck moving methodically back and forth. There was no choice. He walked the half-mile back to the house, the sense of failure heavy on his shoulders. The next morning, the real work began. The machine shed, usually his sanctuary, felt like a hospital operating room. The patient was terminal. Splitting a tractor is a brutal, greasy, heavy piece of mechanical surgery. First, he had to drain all the fluids: the engine oil, the hydraulic fluid, the thick, honey-colored transmission oil that smelled of burnt steel. He placed heavy wooden blocks under the frame, then used the chain hoist to support the engine. Working with a 3/4-inch drive socket set and a long breaker bar, he began the slow process of loosening the massive bolts that held the engine and torque tube to the transmission housing. They were bolts that hadn't been turned in 20 years, and they fought him every inch of the way, groaning in protest. His knuckles were raw and bleeding inside his gloves. After 2 days of wrestling with rusted bolts and disconnecting linkages, the moment of truth arrived. With his wife, Martha, working the chain hoist with painstaking slowness, Art used a pry bar to gently, carefully separate the two halves of the tractor. The machine broke apart with a final, metallic sigh, revealing the clutch and the input shaft of the transmission. The front half, the engine and front wheels, dangled from the hoist. The back half, the transmission and rear wheels, sat solidly on the floor. The co-op truck driver, a young man named Billy, saw the bisected tractor when he came to deliver diesel fuel. "Heard you broke down, Art," he said, a note of pity in his voice. "Dale's just about finished with his corn already." The news spread through the coffee shop gossip mill like a grass fire. Art Miller's old Farmel was split in two in his shed. Can't get his crop in. Too stubborn to buy a decent tractor. Dale himself drove by one evening, slowing his pickup to a crawl as he passed Art's lane. He didn't stop, didn't wave. He just looked, his expression a mixture of vindication and contempt, before speeding off in a cloud of dust. Each passing car felt like a judgment. The problem was a shattered cluster gear. The teeth were sheared off, and metal shavings had contaminated the entire gearbox. It needed a full rebuild. Parts for a 1951 Farmel M weren't sitting on the shelf at the dealership anymore. Art spent half a day on the phone, the old black rotary phone in the kitchen, calling salvage yards across 3 states. He finally found what he needed at a place 100 miles away, a used gear set from a wrecked tractor. It cost him $75, plus a full day of driving his old truck to go get it. For a week, Art's world shrank to the confines of that machine shed. He worked from before sunrise until long after Martha had gone to bed. He cleaned every gear, every bearing, every square inch of the cast-iron housing with diesel fuel and a wire brush until his hands were numb. He carefully pressed in new bearings and seals, referencing a worn, grease-stained service manual that was nearly as old as the tractor itself. It was slow, meticulous, agonizing work. Every night he'd fall into bed, his body screaming with an exhaustion so deep it felt like it was in his bones. He'd dream of gear teeth and torque specifications, and every day he'd see Dale's progress. Dale finished his corn. He started on his beans. The green shoots in Dale's fields were emerging, while Art's planter still sat cold in the shed. He was falling behind, and a deep, cold knot of fear began to twist in his stomach. He was a farmer with no crop in the ground. It was the ultimate failure. For the first time, he allowed a sliver of doubt to creep in. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was a fool. He could walk into the bank, sign a piece of paper, and have a new tractor delivered the next day. The temptation was a bitter taste in his mouth. But then, as he sat on a stool in his shed, looking at the clean, reassembled transmission, he thought of the bank ledger. His mortgage was paid, the $40,020 was his, the truck was his. This farm, this land his grandfather had broken with a team of mules, was his. There was no payment due on the first of the month. The only person he had to answer to was himself. That thought was the anchor that held him steady. He took a deep breath, the smell of grease and steel filling his lungs, and he got back to work. Finally, after 9 solid days of labor, the Farmall M was whole again. He filled it with fresh fluids, connected the battery, and hit the starter. The engine coughed to life, and when he eased the clutch out and shifted into first gear, it moved forward smoothly, silently. The groan was gone. The sense of relief that washed over him was so profound it almost brought him to his knees. He didn't rest. He hooked up the planter and drove straight to the field, the tractor's headlights cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. He planted for 18 hours straight that first day, stopping only to refill the seed and fertilizer boxes. He worked like a man possessed, fueled by lost time and sheer determination. He finished his corn, then immediately switched over and started on his beans. By the time he was done, his own crops were 2 weeks behind Dale's, a visible, embarrassing difference to anyone who drove down the county road. But they were in the ground. He hadn't broken. He hadn't surrendered. The early 1970s arrived, and the world tilted. Suddenly, the Soviet Union was having a bad harvest, and they wanted to buy American grain. They wanted to buy a lot of it. The news came over the radio, a crackling announcement from the USDA that sent a shockwave through the heartland. Overnight, the price of corn doubled. Soybeans weren't far behind. The era that would later be called the Great Grain Robbery had begun, and for the American farmer, it felt like the floodgates of heaven had opened. For Dale Peterson, it was the ultimate validation. He had more acres, bigger equipment, and he hit the market at its absolute peak. The money flowed in like a river. That first year, he traded his 1066 for a brand new International 1466, a true monster with a V8 diesel engine and over 145 horsepower. He bought a new 6-bottom plow to go with it. The next year, he bought another quarter section of land to the north, paying a price per acre that made the old-timers at the coffee shop shake their heads and whistle. His crowning achievement was the new machine shed. It was a Morton building, 60 feet wide and 120 feet long, with gleaming white steel sides and a bold red roof. It rose from the flat prairie landscape like a monument to modern agriculture, completely dwarfing Art's old barn. Dale's new combines, tractors and planters sat inside on a poured concrete floor, protected from the elements, looking more like a showroom than a working farm. He bought his wife a new Ford Country Squire station wagon with fake wood paneling on the sides. He was no longer just a successful farmer. He was the local titan, the man everyone pointed to as the model of what to do. He was proof that debt was not a risk, but a tool. Art felt the boom, too. His yields were good, and with the prices soaring, he had the two most profitable years of his life. The checks he got from the grain elevator were for amounts he'd never seen before. Martha started talking about a new kitchen, maybe a trip to Florida. But Art was cautious. He'd heard his father and grandfather talk about the boom after the First World War and the devastating bust that followed. He saw the manic gold rush fever gripping his neighbors, and it made him uneasy. He didn't buy a new tractor. He didn't buy more land at inflated prices. Instead, he took the bulk of his profits and walked into the farmer's trust and savings. He paid off the last remaining note on the original 160 acres his family had farmed for a century. He was 42 years old, and, for the first time in his life, completely and totally debt-free. The feeling was lighter than air. With the rest of the money, he made practical, unglamorous investments. He bought a brand-new Lincoln arc welder for the shop. He replaced the worn-out rear tires on the 40,000 20, a significant expense, but a necessary one. He put a new clutch in his old Chevy pickup. The largest portion of the windfall he put into certificates of deposit at the bank, tucking it away for a rainy day he felt was sure to come. His discipline was seen as madness. Dale cornered him at the co-op one afternoon. "Art, I just don't get you," he said, shaking his head. "The bank is literally giving away money. Land values went up 20% last year alone. You're sitting on a gold mine and refusing to dig. You could have bought that Henderson 80 twice over with the profits you made." "That land is yours, Dale," Art said quietly. "You're the one making the payments on it." "It's an investment. You use the bank's money to make more money. It's the modern way," Dale insisted, his frustration growing. "What are you going to do with that cash in the bank? It's losing value every day with this inflation." Art didn't have a clever answer. He just said, "I sleep well at night." Dale threw his hands up in exasperation and walked away. The exchange became another story told around town, further proof that Art Miller was a relic, a man so terrified of the future he was burying his head in the past. Even Martha, who trusted his judgment, would sometimes look wistfully at the Petersons' new station wagon as it drove by. The pressure to keep up, to show the world you were succeeding, was immense. One crisp afternoon in the fall of 1978, Art was at the bank, rolling over one of his CDs. The lobby was busy, filled with the optimistic buzz of a community riding a wave of prosperity. As he waited, he overheard the bank president, Mr. Abernathy, talking to another farmer who was signing papers for a big operating loan. "Now, Frank, this is a variable rate note," Abernathy said, pointing a manicured finger at the fine print. "What's that mean exactly?" the farmer asked, his brow furrowed. "It just means the interest rate could fluctuate. Right now it's at 8%. A real bargain," Abernathy said with a reassuring smile. "The Fed's got to get this inflation under control, of course. Rates might tick up a little bit to cool things off, but they won't stay there for long. Don't you worry about a thing. The good times are here to stay." Art felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine. Variable rate. He looked at the farmer, a good man with a young family, signing his name to a document he didn't fully understand, betting his entire future on the hope that interest rates would stay low and crop prices would stay high forever. He looked out the big plate glass window of the bank at the bustling main street, at the new cars parked along the curb, and the general feeling of endless, effortless wealth. But all Art could hear was his father's voice, a gravelly whisper from years past, spoken over a broken-down piece of machinery. "Son," his father had said, his hands black with grease, Remember the story of Joseph in the Bible. The 7 fat years are always followed by the 7 lean ones. Never you forget that. When everyone else is feasting, you put something away. Because the famine always comes. He finished his business and walked out of the bank into the bright autumn sunshine. But the warmth of the day couldn't touch the chill that had settled deep in his bones. He knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the steel of his tractor's frame, that the feast was about to end. And he had a terrible feeling that most of his neighbors had forgotten how to be hungry. The change began not with a thunderclap, but with a whisper of dust. The summer of 1980 arrived on a hot, dry wind out of the southwest and refused to leave. The sky, once a deep and generous prairie blue, faded to a hazy, bleached-out white. Rains that were forecast would split and go around them, teasing the horizon with dark clouds that never delivered. Corn leaves, which should have been broad and waxy, began to curl in on themselves by midday, a defensive posture against the relentless sun, a sign of thirst that clawed at a farmer's gut. Art watched his crops struggle, but he also watched the machines. The fine, talc-like dust got into everything. It worked its way past air filters, into bearings, and through seals. It turned grease into a gritty, grinding paste. Art spent his evenings not in the house, but in the shed, armed with an air compressor and a grease gun. He blew out the radiator fins on the 40-20 every day, cleaned the air filter with religious devotion, and pumped fresh grease into every Zerk fitting until the old, dirty grease oozed out, carrying the fine grit with it. His old simple machines, with their looser tolerances and fewer complex systems, could tolerate the abuse as long as they were cared for. Dale's operation was a different story. His fleet of new, powerful international harvesters were thoroughbreds, designed for optimal conditions. One afternoon, Art saw the dealership's service truck parked in Dale's lane for the 3rd time in 2 weeks. The next day, he saw Dale himself out in the field, standing beside his massive 1466, its hood tilted open, yelling into the CB radio microphone in his cab. Later, Art heard the story at the co-op. The high temperatures and the fine dust had cooked the seals in the turbocharger. Without the turbo, the big V8 engine was gutless, and the replacement part was on back order from a warehouse in Moline. The downtime, the service call, and the eventual repair would cost Dale more than Art's entire fuel bill for the year. Then came the second blow. In January, in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the president announced a grain embargo. The primary customer for America's surplus grain was suddenly cut off. The market, which had been the foundation of the boom, collapsed overnight. The price of corn at the local elevator was cut nearly in half. Farmers who had stored their grain, hoping for a post-harvest price bump, were now facing a catastrophic loss. Dale, with his massive new grain bins filled to the brim, was one of them. But the final killing stroke came from the east, from Washington, D.C. A man named Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve, determined to slay the dragon of inflation, began cranking up interest rates. 8% became 10. 10 became 12, then 15. The number, announced on the evening news, kept climbing with no ceiling in sight. For Art, who owed no one, it was just a number, a topic of conversation at the coffee shop. For Dale Peterson and a generation of farmers like him, who had signed those variable rate loans Mr. Abernathy was so proud of, it was a death sentence. The first cracks in Dale's empire appeared that spring. He didn't trade for a new planter. The fields he'd bought from the Henderson estate, which he had always meticulously worked and fertilized, looked a little ragged. A few patches of weeds were showing through the young corn. It was a small thing, a sign of scrimping on herbicide, but to a farmer's eye, It was as revealing as a gaping wound. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a frantic, hollow-eyed energy. The smirks were replaced by a grim, tight-lipped expression Art saw on Dale's face as he drove past, his gaze fixed on the road ahead as if he were afraid to look at the fields on either side. The monument to modern agriculture, Dale's gleaming Morton building, began to look different. It was no longer a symbol of progress, but a cage of obligations, each square foot representing another dollar of debt owed to the bank. One evening in May, Art was in his shed, welding a crack on his cultivator shank. The soft hiss and bright blue-white flash of the arc welder was a familiar comfort. He heard a vehicle pull into his lane and stop. It was Dale's Ford pickup. Dale got out and walked slowly toward the open shed door, stopping just outside the circle of light cast by the single bare bulb. He looked thin, his face pale under his farmer's tan. "Art," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual bravado. "You still got that old wire-tie baler of your dad's?" Art switched off the welder, the sudden silence ringing in his ears. He lifted the dark lens of his helmet. "Yeah, in the back of the barn. Hasn't been used in years, but I expect it'd still work." "The clutch went out on my new Heston round baler," Dale said, his eyes on the ground. "Dealership wants $3,000 for the parts and labor. Can't do it. Just can't." He finally looked up, and Art saw the desperation in his eyes. "I was wondering if I could maybe borrow your old one to get my first cutting of hay put up." To borrow a piece of equipment so old, so obsolete, was the ultimate admission of defeat. It was a confession of utter financial ruin. Dale, the man who had mocked Art's museum pieces, was now asking to borrow one. Art didn't hesitate. He didn't bring up the past. He simply nodded. "Sure, Dale. Let's go pull it out. We'll probably need to put some air in the tires." As they walked toward the old barn, the silence between them was heavy with everything that had gone unsaid for the past decade. It was the sound of an empire crumbling. The following year, the crisis deepened into a full-blown catastrophe. The prime interest rate peaked at over 20%. The letters from farmers, trust and savings started arriving in mailboxes all over the county. They were cold, formal documents filled with words like delinquency, acceleration clause, and foreclosure. The conversations at the coffee shop were no longer about yields and horsepower. They were hushed, fearful whispers about who had received their notice, who was having a sale. The sense of boundless optimism that had defined the 70s was replaced by a thick, choking fog of despair. Farm auctions became a weekly ritual, but they were grim affairs. They weren't like the Henderson sale, full of opportunity. These were funerals for a way of life. Families stood by, stone-faced, as their heritage was sold off piece by piece to the handful of bargain hunters who still had cash. More often than not, the only real bidder was a representative from the bank, buying back the equipment for a fraction of what they had loaned on it, the final, cruel turn of the knife. The notice for the Peterson sale appeared in the county paper in the fall of 1982. It was a full-page ad, a testament to how much there was to liquidate. The 1466 tractor, the 12-row planter, the big Gleaner combine, the 6-bottom plough, the Morton building itself, to be moved, and the land. All 480 acres Dale had accumulated, including the Henderson 80 and his own family's home quarter section. Art went to the sale. He felt he had to. He stood at the back, just as he had at the Henderson auction years ago. But this time the feeling was different. There was no sense of opportunity, only a profound, aching sadness. He saw Dale standing near the house, with his wife and son, looking like ghosts at their own wake. The swaggering titan of agriculture was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out man who looked 20 years older than he was. The auctioneer tried to work up some enthusiasm, but his rapid-fire chant felt obscene, a dance on the grave of a man's dream. The bids were pitifully low. A four-wheel drive tractor that Dale had paid $80,000 for just 3 years earlier sold for $22,000. The big disc ripper went for a song. Art watched as the machinery, the very symbols of Dale's identity, were sold off, loaded onto strangers' trailers, and hauled away down the lane. When the auctioneer moved on to the land, a different man stepped forward. It was Mr. Abernathy, the bank president, his face a mask of professional solemnity. He was there to officiate the foreclosure sale. He started with the Henderson 80. The opening bid was from the bank itself, a number so low it was an insult to the black, fertile soil. No one counted. The land Dale had been so proud to acquire was gone in an instant. The other parcels followed, all reclaimed by the bank for pennies on the dollar. Art survived. While his neighbors were drowning in interest payments, he had none. While crop prices were in the cellar, his low operating costs meant he could still scrape by. The money he'd put into CDs during the boom years was now earning 20% interest, a steady stream of income that acted as a buffer against the storm. He wasn't getting rich, but he was holding on. His old John Deere Verhorses 20, faded and dented, became a symbol of his resilience. Every morning, its 6-cylinder diesel engine fired to life with a familiar, comforting rhythm. It asked for nothing but fuel, grease, and the occasional repair he could perform himself in his own shed. He learned to be even leaner. Instead of spraying all his bean fields, he mounted the old cultivators on the 40-20 and spent weeks driving slowly up and down the rows, letting steel kill the weeds instead of expensive chemicals. It was slow, tedious work, the kind of farming Dale had called obsolete, but every hour he spent on the tractor seat was an hour he was winning, an hour he was surviving. A few days after the auction, Art was checking a fence line that bordered Dale's home place. He saw Dale out by the empty Morton building, throwing some old tires and junk into the back of his pickup. The truck was all he had left. Art pulled his own truck over and got out. "Dale," he said, his voice quiet. Dale didn't turn around for a moment. When he did, his face was a wreck of exhaustion and shame. "Come to say I told you so?" he asked, his voice rough. "No," Art said simply. "Came to see if you needed a hand." Dale let out a short, bitter laugh. "A hand? It's over, Art. The bank took everything. We have to be out of the house by the 1st of the month. 30 days to vacate the farm my grandfather homesteaded." He kicked at a loose piece of gravel. "You were right. All this time you were right. I built a house of cards on borrowed money, and the first stiff breeze blew it all away. I'm a fool." Art looked past Dale, at the house, and to the old barn, the same kind of barn his own grandfather had built. He looked at the rich black soil that had been in Dale's family for 3 generations, and he thought of the money in his bank account, the money he had saved during the fat years, earning interest, waiting for a purpose. He had always assumed that purpose was to protect his own family, to secure his own farm. But now, looking at the wreckage of his neighbor's life, a different purpose began to form in his mind. "The sale on your home quarter," Art said. "Has the bank filed the final deed yet?" Dale shook his head. "Takes a few weeks for the paperwork to clear." "Why?" "Just wondering," Art said. He looked at Dale, seeing not the arrogant rival from years past, but just another farmer who loved the land and had lost his way. "Don't give up yet, Dale. It's not over till it's over." The following Monday, Art put on his only suit, a dark blue one he wore to weddings and funerals, and drove to the county seat. He walked into the farmer's trust and savings, past the tellers, and straight to Mr. Abernathy's office. The bank president, who had always treated Art with a kind of dismissive pity, looked up in surprise. "Arthur, what can I do for you?" Abernathy asked, gesturing to a chair. Art didn't sit down. He stood in front of the big mahogany desk, his hands clasped behind his back. "I'm here about the Peterson farm, the home quarter section." Abernathy's expression tightened. A tragic situation, truly. Dale was a bit too aggressive, I'm afraid. Over-leveraged. "I want to buy it," Art said, his voice even. The banker's eyebrows shot up. "You do? Well, the bank would be happy to offer you a very attractive financing package. With your debt-free status, you're an ideal borrower." "I won't be needing a loan," Art said. He pulled a passbook from his inside coat pocket and laid it on the desk. "I'll be paying cash." Abernathy opened the book. His eyes widened as he saw the balance in Art's savings account, the accumulated principal and high interest from the CDs he'd been rolling over for years. It was a staggering sum for a man everyone thought was just scraping by. The banker looked from the passbook to Art, and for the first time, a look of genuine respect dawned on his face. This wasn't the stubborn relic he thought he knew. This was a man who had played a different game altogether, and won. They haggled over the price, but Art held firm. He knew what the bank had paid for it at the auction, and he knew they just wanted it off their books. He offered them a small profit, and not a penny more. In the end, Abernathy agreed. Art signed the papers, and with a single check, he bought the 160 acres that had been the heart of the Peterson family for nearly a century. He didn't go tell Dale right away. Instead, he went home and spent the rest of the day in his shed, the place where he made sense of the world. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt a heavy weight of responsibility. That evening, he drove his old truck down Dale's lane one more time. He found Dale and his wife, Martha, packing boxes on the porch, their faces etched with a weary resignation. He walked up the steps, holding a piece of paper in his hand. "Dale, Martha," he said, "I need to talk to you." He explained what he had done. He told them he was now the owner of their farm. Dale's face went pale, thinking Art was there to evict them personally. "But I'm not looking for a new farm to work," Art continued, his voice gentle. "I've got all I can handle. And this land, it's not my family's land, it's yours. So I've drawn up a rental agreement." He handed the paper to Dale. "It's a cash rent lease. The price is low, just enough to cover the property taxes and a little bit for my trouble. And I've put in a clause," he pointed to a line of type, "an option to buy. In 5 years, if you can get back on your feet, you can buy the whole place back from me for exactly what I paid for it. Not a penny more." Dale stared at the paper, his hands trembling. He looked up at Art, his eyes swimming with tears. The magnitude of the gesture, the sheer, unearned grace of it, was too much to comprehend. He tried to speak, but no words came out. It was his wife, Martha Peterson, who finally broke the silence. "Why?" she whispered. "After all the years, the way he treated you. Why would you do this for us?" Art looked out at the fields, dark and peaceful in the twilight. He thought of his father's words about the fat years and the lean years. He thought of what it meant to be a neighbor. "Because the bank is in the business of owning paper," he said, his gaze returning to them. "Farmers are in the business of owning land. It's just not right for this place to belong to a bank." The years that followed were lean, but they were healing. The frantic, debt-fueled pace of the 70s was gone, replaced by a more sober and sustainable rhythm. Dale Peterson, humbled and grateful, became a different man. He took an off-farm job at the elevator to make ends meet and farmed his home place on the evenings and weekends. He started coming over to Art's shed, not to borrow tools, but to learn. He watched Art weld, watched him rebuild a hydraulic pump, watched him diagnose an engine problem by sound alone. The old rivalry was burned away, replaced by a quiet, profound friendship forged in the fires of the crisis. The community changed too. Art Miller, the man they had once dismissed as a stubborn old fool, was now regarded as a kind of prophet. His machine shed became a gathering place, a school where the forgotten arts of self-sufficiency were taught to a younger generation of farmers who were struggling to survive. They came to him for advice, and he gave it freely, never once saying, "I told you so." His vindication wasn't in being right. It was in being able to help. 5 years to the day after Art had bought the farm, Dale came to his door with a cashier's check in his hand. He had worked and saved and scrimped, and with the help of a modest, sensible loan from a different bank, he was exercising his option to buy back his family's land. The handshake between the two men on Art's porch that afternoon was a quiet, powerful moment, a testament to resilience, forgiveness, and the enduring strength of a community. Years later, well into the 90s, Art was an old man. His hair was white, and his hands were gnarled with arthritis, but he still spent most of his days in the machine shed. His son, who had left for the city years ago, had come back home, eager to learn the ways of the farm. One afternoon, Art was showing his grandson, a boy of 10, the heart of the John Deere 4020, which still served as the main tractor on the farm. Its green paint was almost completely gone in places, worn down to the primer and the bare steel by decades of sun and work. "Grandpa," the boy asked, "why didn't you ever buy a new tractor? One with a cab and air conditioning like Mr. Peterson has now?" Art wiped a bit of grease from a fitting with a clean rag. He looked at the old tractor, at every dent and scar, each one a memory. He thought of the auctions, the variable rate loans, the desperation he had seen in the eyes of his friends and neighbors. He thought of the quiet satisfaction of owning something completely, of being beholden to no one. He placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Because a new tractor can make you a living," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "But an old one you can fix yourself, that can save your life. This land, this farm, it's not about getting rich. It's about holding on. You don't bet the farm, ever. You take care of it, and it'll take care of you." He looked out the wide door of the shed, across the fields his grandfather had first ploughed with a team of horses. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows. He saw his own land, secure and paid for, and across the fence line he saw Dale's land, also secure, a testament to a lesson learned the hard way. He had not built an empire. He had not chased the modern dream. He had simply held on, stubbornly, quietly, to the old ways. And in the end, that had been more than enough. It had been everything.